I was in urgent care at 2 in the morning, convinced I was having a heart attack. My blood pressure was 158/97. The doctor asked when I'd last taken a day off, and I couldn't remember. 3 weeks later, my old boss, the one whose nephew had fired me over a $14 lunch receipt, called and offered me 40% equity in the company I'd spent 11 years building. My name on the door, full autonomy, everything I'd ever wanted. I was exhausted. I was broke. I was on blood pressure medication. At 43, my sister told me to take the deal, and I said no. I hung up the phone and sat on my kitchen floor while my dog put his head on my leg. And I wondered if I'd just made the biggest mistake of my life. But let me start from the beginning. Quick thing before we dive in: if this story hooks you, smash that like button and subscribe. New stories every day. I'm posting this from a throwaway because there's still an open mediation connected to some of this, and my lawyer would prefer I not use real names. I'm sharing it now because the non-solicitation period expired last month. And honestly, I need someone to tell me whether the thing I did with the CRM was actually as justified as I keep telling myself it was. My name isn't important, but for this story, you can call me Diane. I'm 43. I live outside Denver, and for 11 years, I was the person who kept Millhaven Consulting Group running while pretending I wasn't. I started at Millhaven in June of 2014 as an account coordinator, making $41,000 a year. The firm did IT infrastructure consulting for mid-sized companies. Not glamorous, but steady. The owner, Gerald Lofthouse, had started it in his garage in 2003 and grown it to about 30 employees by the time I came on. Gerald was old school, handshake deals, paper files. The man had a filing cabinet he literally padlocked shut every night. He once told me he didn't trust any system he couldn't unplug. Within 2 years, I'd taken over all client-facing operations. By 2018, I was personally managing 23 key accounts that represented about 87% of the firm's revenue. I built the CRM from scratch using Salesforce because Gerald refused to pay a consultant to do it. I watched maybe 40 hours of YouTube tutorials to figure out the custom objects. I set up the entire proposal pipeline, the billing integration with QuickBooks, the client onboarding workflow. I wrote the templates. I trained the junior staff. I remembered every client's spouse's name, their kids' birthdays, their dog's dietary restrictions. Marcus Chen at Data Vault Solutions once told me, over beers at this place called Tap and Barrel near his office, that he stayed with Millhaven specifically because of me. I never made more than $74,000 a year. I asked for raises twice. Both times, Gerald said the money wasn't there. And look, maybe that was true. Gerald wasn't flashy. He drove a nice car, a Lexus, dark blue, always clean. But he also reinvested a lot into the company. He wasn't greedy. He just couldn't see what was right in front of him. I was a line item on a spreadsheet to him, not a strategic asset. I hate that phrase. Strategic asset makes me sound like a piece of equipment, but that's what I mean. I also need to be honest about something. I knew I was underpaid. I knew I was the backbone of the operation, and I stayed anyway for 11 years. That's not noble. That's me being comfortable and scared, and telling myself the job security was worth it. I should own that. Now, enter Kyle. Kyle Lofthouse was Gerald's sister's kid, 26 years old, business degree from a small program in Arizona. I want to say it was like a satellite campus of ASU, but I'm not sure. He'd worked at 2 other consulting firms before this, both briefly, and he'd been let go from the second one during a round of layoffs. Gerald mentioned at a team lunch in January of 2025 that Kyle was joining to learn the business. We were at a Panera, I remember, because I was picking at a bread bowl and trying very hard to keep my face neutral. But here's where I have to give you a more honest version than the one I told myself for months afterward. Kyle wasn't stupid. Some of his ideas were actually fine. The expense pre-approval system he wanted to implement. Most companies our size already had one. The project management software he brought in, we genuinely needed it. The 7:45 a.m. stand-ups, annoying but not crazy. Kyle's problem wasn't that his ideas were bad. His problem was that he had zero sense of how to push change through without torching every relationship in the building. And he needed to be in charge of things way before he understood them. By March, Gerald promoted Kyle to vice president of operations 8 weeks in, but Gerald was 61 and tired, and I think he genuinely wanted a succession plan that kept the company in the family. I got that, even if I hated it. Kyle and I actually had a decent working relationship for the first 2 weeks of his VP role. He asked me smart questions about the client accounts. He sat in on a few calls and mostly listened. I remember thinking, okay, maybe this can work. Then he started making changes without telling me, restructured the account team reporting lines, put himself as the primary contact on 3 client accounts, including Bridgepoint Logistics. Clients started getting emails from Kyle that had typos and wrong contract details. One of them had the billing rate from a completely different client pasted in. I went to Gerald about it. Gerald told me to give Kyle time. I went to Kyle directly. He told me he appreciated my input, but he needed room to develop his own leadership style. That's when I stopped trying. Then came Friday, March 14th, 2025. I had taken a client, Reena Patel from Bridgepoint Logistics, to lunch that Tuesday. We went to a Thai place near their office, this little spot called Siam Kitchen, or Siam something. The bill was $14.22. Mine was a pad CU. Hers was a green curry. I submitted the receipt through our normal expense system, the same way I had literally hundreds of times before. Here's the thing. Kyle had actually sent an email about the new pre-approval policy the previous Monday to the whole staff. I'd seen it. I read it, and I decided it was ridiculous for amounts under $50, and I ignored it. That's on me. I decided that a policy from someone I didn't respect didn't apply to me. And yeah, I can see now how that's its own kind of arrogance. Kyle flagged the receipt. He called me into the conference room at 3:47 p.m. on that Friday. Gerald wasn't there. Kyle had printed out the receipt and his own email from the week before, both highlighted in yellow marker, like he went to Staples and bought a yellow highlighter for this meeting. He told me the expense was unauthorized. I did not handle it well. I told him his policy was a waste of everyone's time. I told him he'd been there 2 months and didn't understand the first thing about client relationship management. I told him that Reena Patel's account alone was worth $212,000 annually, and that she specifically requested lunches with me because that's how our industry works. I was condescending. I was dismissive. I was, if I'm being completely honest, cruel to a 26-year-old who was in over his head and trying to prove himself, which, looking back, was pretty ugly of me. He said, and this is burned into my memory, I don't care how long you've been here. You don't get to decide which policies apply to you if you can't follow basic procedures. I don't see how we can move forward. He fired me right there on a Friday afternoon over $14.22. And a power struggle that had been building for weeks. Was the firing disproportionate? Absolutely. Was I completely blameless? No. And that's the part of this story that makes it real instead of a fairy tale. Then he called Danny, our part-time building maintenance guy, who also sometimes watched the parking lot. Danny looked like he wanted to die. He mouthed sorry as he walked me to my car with a banker's box of my things. I remember the box had a broken handle, and I had to carry it from the bottom. I sat in my car in that parking lot for 20 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there with the engine off, running numbers in my head. See, here's what Kyle didn't fully understand. I was Millhaven's client relationships, not the logo, not the office, not Gerald's name on the door. Me. Every proposal, every renewal, every crisis call at 11 p.m. on a Sunday, and I had never signed a non-compete agreement. Gerald had talked about it once in 2016, and then never followed up. I'd noticed. Trust me, I'd noticed. Now here's the part I need to talk about, because it's the part that still keeps me up some nights. The CRM, the Salesforce system, with every client contact, every contract detail, every note from every meeting for the past 7 years. It was built on my personal admin credentials because Gerald was too cheap to set up proper enterprise licensing. The whole system was technically tied to my personal email address. When they deactivated my company email that Friday, the admin access went with it. I didn't do anything to sabotage it. I didn't change any passwords. I didn't delete a single record, but I also didn't volunteer to help them untangle it. When Gerald's office manager called me that Monday, asking how to restore access, I told her I'd be happy to consult on it at a rate of $200 an hour. She hung up, never called back. Was that legally fine? Yes. My lawyer confirmed it 3 separate times. Was it ethically clean? I genuinely don't know. 7 years of client data and custom workflows were locked behind integrations that only I understood. People who had nothing to do with my firing people I liked couldn't do their jobs properly for weeks. They eventually hired a Salesforce consultant who charged them $18,000 to rebuild Access. And even then, half the custom workflows were broken. That part bothers me. I'm telling you this because it still bothers me. And most people who tell stories like this conveniently leave out the parts that make them look bad. But I had my own problems to deal with. Monday morning, March 17th, I filed my LLC, Ridgeline Advisory Partners. I'd had the name in my head for years. Honestly, I think I came up with it on a hike near Red Rocks, which is kind of embarrassing, but whatever. By Monday afternoon, I had a website up, Squarespace template, the one called Bedford, or something like that, professional headshot. I'd gotten done 6 months earlier for LinkedIn, a simple message. Boutique IT consulting, built on relationships. Then I updated my LinkedIn. One post, a simple announcement that I'd started my own firm. I want to be very clear about this because it matters legally. I did not directly solicit a single Millhaven client. My phone rang 11 times before noon on Tuesday. Marcus Chen at Data Vault was first. He said, "Honestly, Diane, I've been hoping you'd do this." His contract with Millhaven was up for renewal in April. He signed with me that week. Reena Patel at Bridgepoint Logistics called Wednesday. She was furious when she heard what happened. Her account moved to me before the end of March. But here's where the story stops being the clean revenge fantasy you might be expecting. Tom Whitfield at Pryor. And Pryor called me that Thursday. He was interested. We had a good conversation. Then he called back 2 days later and said he'd decided to stay with Millhaven. He told me honestly that he felt a loyalty to Gerald that he couldn't shake, and that he was uncomfortable with how fast everything was happening. He said it felt like I was picking the company apart while it was still bleeding. That stung. It stung because he wasn't wrong. Not entirely. Sarah Nakamura at Green Step Environmental also stayed. She told me she liked me personally, but didn't want to get caught in the middle of what she called a messy divorce. She wished me well and said maybe down the road, but not now. And the Westfield Medical Group, which was 3 separate contracts worth $347,000 combined. Gerald personally called every contact there. He drove out to their office. He promised hands-on service and assigned his 2 best remaining consultants to the accounts. Westfield stayed with Millhaven. Gerald was fighting for his company. And honestly, I respect that even though we were on opposite sides of it. So the final count, after 6 weeks, wasn't the avalanche I'd imagined sitting in that parking lot. I had 12 of the 23 accounts, about $1 million in annual contract value. That's significant. That's devastating to a firm Millhaven's size. But it wasn't a clean sweep. And $1 million in contract value doesn't mean $1 million in revenue when you're a solo operator who still needs to actually deliver the work. Which brings me to June and the part of this story I've never told anyone outside my family. By June, I was drowning. 12 accounts and 2 employees. I'd hired Janelle Morrison and David Kwan from Millhaven, two of the best junior consultants I'd ever trained, but we were still desperately understaffed for the workload I'd taken on. I was working 18-hour days, 7 days a week. I was eating Trader Joe's frozen meals at my desk at midnight. I missed a deliverable deadline for Data Vault, my very first client 3 months in. Marcus was understanding about it, barely. And that brings us to the moment I told you about at the start, the panic attack at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in June. Or maybe it was a Wednesday. My dog was asleep on the couch next to me, and I thought, I'm going to die in front of my dog at my IKEA desk. That's how this ends. I drove myself to urgent care. She gave me this look. You know the look. The one where they're trying not to say what they're thinking. I also made a financial mistake that almost sank the whole thing. I'd priced my contracts too aggressively to win them, matching Millhaven's rates, when I should have charged a premium for the personalized service I was offering. By July, after paying Janelle and David, covering the Salesforce Enterprise license, the insurance, the accountant, the legal fees from the non-solicitation review, and those legal fees were insane. By the way, like $11,000, just for the review. I was personally taking home less than I'd made at Millhaven. The irony was not lost on me. I'd blown up my career and rebuilt it into something that was paying me worse. Then came the other moment from the beginning of this story. Gerald called, mid-July. This time I answered. I almost didn't. I was in my car, in a King Soopers parking lot, and I just sat there, watching it ring for a second. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He sounded exhausted. He said Kyle had been moved out of the VP role and into a project manager position where he couldn't do any more damage. He said he knew he'd made mistakes, that he should have listened to me, that he should have given me the raise, that he should have never let Kyle anywhere near the client relationships. And then he made the offer, 40% equity in Millhaven, full autonomy over client operations, my name next to his on the door. He said he'd already talked to his lawyer about the paperwork. I want you to understand how tempting that was. I was exhausted. I was scared about money. I was burning through savings. My blood pressure was still too high, and I was on medication for it now. And here was the easy path back to stability. 40% of a company I already knew inside and out, with a built-in team, existing infrastructure, and no more 2 a.m. panic attacks alone in my home office. I told him I needed a week to think about it, and I actually did think about it. I made spreadsheets. I ran projections. I called my sister, who told me to take the deal. I barely slept, which at that point was just normal for me, but I kept coming back to the same thing. Gerald didn't call because he valued me. He called because he was losing. 11 years. He'd never once offered me equity. 11 years. He couldn't find the budget for a raise above $74,000. He found 40% now because his revenue was falling off a cliff, and he needed someone to stop it. I wasn't being offered a partnership. I was being offered a rescue mission with my name on the liability. I said no, and you already know how that felt. Terrifying, not triumphant. My dog came over and put his head on my leg, almost made me lose it. The rest played out roughly how you'd expect, but slower and messier than the version I'd fantasized about in that parking lot back in March. I raised my rates in August, lost one small client over at Kenner Data. They went to some discount outfit, and honestly, good luck to them. But the margins on everything else improved enough to matter. Westfield Medical finally moved their contracts to me in September, after Gerald couldn't staff their accounts properly anymore. That brought me up to 14 accounts total. Millhaven laid off 8 people that same month. I felt terrible for every one of them. Some of them had been my friends for years. I couldn't hire most of them. I didn't have the revenue yet. In November, Gerald put Millhaven up for sale. The firm he'd spent 22 years building. A competitor bought the name, and the remaining client list for somewhere around $400,000. Gerald had turned down an acquisition offer of $1 million in 2022. He turned it down because he thought the firm was worth more, and in a way, he was right. It was worth more when I was there. As for Kyle, he left Millhaven before the sale closed. He moved back to Arizona and landed an operations manager role at a mid-sized logistics company. I looked him up once on LinkedIn out of curiosity and felt nothing, which surprised me. I'd expected anger or satisfaction, something. Instead, there was just nothing. He was a 26-year-old who got handed authority he wasn't ready for by an uncle who should have known better. Gerald made the bigger mistake. Kyle was just the match, not the gasoline. Gerald retired. I hope he's okay. I mean that. He gave me my start in this industry. He just never understood what he had until it walked out the door, carrying a banker's box with a broken handle. As for me, Ridgeline Advisory Partners just had its 1-year anniversary. I have 9 employees. Revenue is on track to clear $3 million this year. I pay every single person on my team fairly. I have a proper Salesforce enterprise license with 3 backup admins because I never want to be the reason someone else can't do their job. I gave myself a real salary for the first time in my career, and it's a number that actually makes sense. But I won't tell you I'm grateful. I won't say Kyle did me a favor. Getting fired was humiliating. Starting over at 43 was the hardest thing I've ever done. That night in urgent care was one of the worst nights of my life. Months of 18-hour days and dwindling savings, and wondering if I'd just made the worst decision of my career. I built something I'm proud of, but I built it because I had no other option, and it nearly broke me. What I will say is this: I'd do it again, not because it felt good, because for the first time, what I was building was mine. Last month, Marcus Chen took me to dinner to celebrate our 1-year partnership. He ordered a bottle of wine that cost more than the lunch receipt that got me fired. I didn't make some big speech about it. I just drank really good wine and thought about what a weird year it's been. So let me ask you this: have you ever been in a situation where someone else's screw-up turned into your shot, but the shot almost took you out before it worked? I want to hear about it. Drop it in the comments. Thanks for listening. I didn't plan any of this, but I'd do it all again.